Frank Sinatra was in the middle of my way at Madison Square Garden when a wheelchair-bound war veteran in the front row did something that made Frank stop singing and break down crying on stage. What happened next changed not just that veteran's life, but the entire way America treated its returning soldiers. It was December 8th, 1969 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Frank Sinatra was performing what he'd promised would be his final concert before retirement. The arena was packed with 20,789 people who'd paid top dollar to see the chairman of the board one last time. Frank had already electrified the crowd with Come Fly With Me, New York, New York, and Strangers in the Night. Now he was settling into the emotional crescendo of his set, the song that had become his signature anthem of independence and resilience, My Way. The audience was singing along, lighters were swaying in the darkness, and Frank was delivering the performance of his lifetime. But what none of them knew was that in the front row, wheelchair section, sat a 24-year-old man who wasn't supposed to be alive. Sergeant Michael James Morrison had been home from Vietnam for exactly 47 days. The landmine that had taken both his legs below the knee had also taken something else, his will to live. Michael had been one of the most decorated young soldiers in his unit. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Silver Star for valor. But all those medals couldn't give him back his legs, couldn't erase the nightmares, and couldn't make people stop looking at him with pity instead of respect. His sister, Patricia Morrison, had used her entire savings to buy these front-row tickets. Mike loved Sinatra, she told their mother that morning. If anything can reach him, it's Frank. For 3 months since coming home, Michael had barely spoken. He refused visitors, turned away fellow veterans, and spent most of his days staring at the wall in the VA hospital. The doctors called it severe depression with suicidal ideation. Patricia called it a broken heart. She noticed that the only time Michael showed any emotion was when Sinatra's music played on the radio. Something about Frank's voice, that combination of strength and vulnerability, seemed to penetrate the walls Michael had built around himself. Getting Michael to the concert had been a battle. He'd refused at first, said he didn't want people staring at the cripple in the wheelchair. But Patricia had persisted, and finally, reluctantly, Michael had agreed to go. As Frank began My Way, Michael felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't felt since before the landmine. The lyrics seemed to speak directly to his situation, about facing challenges, taking hits, and standing tall despite everything. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. Michael's hands gripped the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The emotions he'd been suppressing for months were bubbling to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. And then it happened. As Frank reached the climactic verse, I did it my way. Something inside Michael broke open. Without thinking, without planning. He shouted at the top of his lungs, a raw, primal sound that cut through the music, and the crowd noised like a gunshot. Frank, I can't do it my way anymore. I don't have a way. The arena didn't go silent immediately. At first, people thought it was just an overly enthusiastic fan. But Frank heard something in that voice, something desperate and real that made him stop singing mid-word. He held up his hand, and the Count Basie Orchestra, confused but obedient, gradually stopped playing. The spotlight found Michael in his wheelchair, tears streaming down his face, his sister trying to comfort him, clearly mortified that her brother had disrupted the concert. Frank Sinatra stood at the microphone, squinting into the lights, trying to see who had called out. Sir, Frank said, his voice carrying that unmistakable New Jersey authority. What did you say? Michael, now realizing what he'd done, tried to shrink back into his wheelchair. But Patricia, seeing an opportunity, stood up. Mr. Sinatra, she called out, her voice shaking. This is my brother, Sergeant Michael Morrison. He just got back from Vietnam. He lost both his legs, saving his platoon. The arena went completely quiet. 20,789 people all turned to look at this young man in a wheelchair, wearing his dress uniform, medals pinned to his chest, tears running down his face. Frank walked to the edge of the stage, his hand over his eyes to block the spotlight glare. Sergeant, Frank said, his voice softer now, but still carrying through the sound system. What's your name, son? Michael Morrison, sir, Michael managed to say, his voice barely audible. United States Army, 1st Infantry Division. Frank stood there for a moment, and everyone in the arena could see his jaw tighten, his eyes getting misty. What did you mean when you said you can't do it your way anymore? Michael looked up at Frank Sinatra, this icon of American masculinity and success, and in front of almost 21,000 strangers, told the truth. I used to have a way, sir. I was going to be a teacher. I was going to marry my girlfriend. I was going to coach Little League and take my kids fishing. But then I went to Vietnam, and now I'm half a man in a chair, and my girlfriend won't look at me, and nobody wants a crippled teacher, and I don't have a way anymore. The honesty of it, the raw pain in every word, hit the arena like a physical force. Women were crying. Men were wiping their eyes. Even the hardened New York crowd that had seen everything was moved by this young soldier's anguish. Frank Sinatra did something then that nobody expected. He turned to Count Basie and said, "Bill, we're taking an intermission." Then he addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to bear with me. I know you paid good money to see a show tonight, but this young man right here, this soldier, he's more important than any song I could ever sing." Some people in the audience started applauding, but Frank held up his hand. "I'm going to need complete silence for what happens next, and I'm going to need everyone in this arena to respect the courage of this young man." Frank walked off stage, leaving 20,789 people in stunned confusion. Backstage, Frank was moving with a purpose that shocked his entire crew. "Get that soldier backstage." Now, Frank ordered his road manager, Tony Apedisano. "Frank, we have a show to finish," Tony started to say. Frank cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. That boy fought for his country, lost his legs, and came here looking for hope. I'll be damned if I'm going to sing songs while he sits out there in pain. Get him backstage. Now, within minutes, security was carefully wheeling Michael backstage, with Patricia following close behind. Michael was in shock, barely believing what was happening. In Frank Sinatra's dressing room, something remarkable occurred. Frank pulled up a chair and sat down, so he was eye level with Michael. "Kid," Frank said, lighting a cigarette, "let me tell you something about doing it your way. The way isn't about your legs. It's about your heart." Michael looked at this legend, this man who'd survived mob connections, bad press, failed marriages, career ups and downs, and somehow remained standing. "Mr. Sinatra," Michael said quietly, "I don't know how to live like this. I look at myself and I see half a man." Frank leaned forward. "You know what I see? I see a kid who took a landmine blast and survived. I see a soldier who saved his whole platoon. I see a man who's got more courage in his pinky finger than most men have in their whole body." Michael shook his head. "I can't walk, sir. I can't dance. I can't do the things that make me feel like a man." Frank stood up and did something unexpected. He walked over to his dressing table, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Michael. "You see that picture?" Frank asked. "That's my old man, Marty Sinatra. Worked as a fireman in Hoboken. Died when I was young. You know what he taught me? He taught me that a man isn't measured by what he can do with his body. He's measured by what he does with his character." Michael stared at the photograph, then up at Frank. "But you don't understand what it's like," he started to say. Frank's voice got harder, but not unkind. "Don't I? Kid, I weighed 13 pounds when I was born. The doctors said I wouldn't live. I was so small and sickly that kids called me Bones my whole childhood. I got rejected by the Army in World War II because I had a perforated eardrum. You think I didn't feel like less of a man watching everyone else go fight?" Michael looked up, surprised. "But you became Frank Sinatra, and you're going to become Michael Morrison," Frank said firmly. "Not half a man, not a cripple. Michael Morrison, a man who fought for his country, survived hell, and now gets to figure out what's next." "But I don't know what's next," Michael said, his voice breaking. "That's the point, kid," Frank said, grinning now. "None of us know. That's what makes it an adventure." Frank sat back down and looked Michael dead in the eye. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come back out on that stage with me, and you're going to help me finish this concert." Michael's eyes went wide. "Mr. Sinatra, I can't perform." I'm not a singer. I don't need you to sing, Frank said. I need you to show 20,000 people what courage looks like. I need you to remind everyone, including yourself, that you're still here. You're still fighting. You're still standing, even if you're sitting down. Michael started to protest, but Frank held up his hand. Kid, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone from the stage before. The reason I sang my way, the reason that song means something to me, is because I almost quit multiple times. In the early 50s, I was washed up. Voice was gone. Career was dead. I was broke and humiliated. Frank's voice got quieter. I thought about eating a bullet, kid. I really did. Just ending it all because I couldn't see a way forward. Michael stared at Frank Sinatra, stunned. You did? Frank nodded. Yeah, but you know what stopped me? The same thing that's going to stop you from giving up. The knowledge that the story ain't over until you decide it's over. You think you don't have a way. Bull, you're 24 years old. You've got 50, maybe 60 years ahead of you. That's a lot of time to figure out your way. Patricia, who had been standing quietly in the corner, spoke up. Mr. Sinatra, Michael wanted to be a teacher. He was studying to teach history before he enlisted. Frank's face lit up. A history teacher. Kid, you just lived through one of the most important moments in American history. You were in Vietnam. You've got stories that need to be told, lessons that need to be taught. You think kids won't want to learn history from a guy who actually lived it? But who's going to hire me like this? Michael asked. Frank pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. Here's the private number for the headmaster at St. Anthony's Prep in Jersey. He's a friend of mine. You call him next week. Tell him Frank Sinatra sent you. And you tell him you want to teach. If he gives you any grief about the wheelchair, you give him my number, and I'll personally come down there and sort him out. Michael took the card with shaking hands. Why are you doing this for me? Frank's voice got very quiet. Because someone did it for me once. And because you earned it, kid. You put on that uniform. You went to a war we shouldn't have sent you to. You saved your friends, and you came back. That's more than most of us ever do. Now you're going to do one more thing. You're going to come out on that stage and show 20,000 people what a real hero looks like. When Frank Sinatra walked back onto the Madison Square Garden stage 20 minutes later, he wasn't alone. He was walking beside Michael Morrison's wheelchair, pushing it himself, refusing to let anyone else do it. The sight of Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, pushing a wounded veteran in a wheelchair onto the stage, created an immediate hush over the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion, I want you to meet someone very special. This is Sergeant Michael James Morrison, United States Army, 1st Infantry Division. The arena erupted in applause, but Frank held up his hand for quiet. Sergeant Morrison here just got back from Vietnam 47 days ago. He was 22 years old when he stepped on a landmine trying to save his platoon. He lost both his legs. But you know what he didn't lose? He didn't lose his courage. He didn't lose his heart. And he sure as hell didn't lose his right to live the rest of his life with dignity and purpose. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Michael, Frank said, turning to the young veteran, you told me earlier that you don't have a way anymore. I'm here to tell you, in front of all these people, that you're wrong. You've got more way than most people ever find. And we're going to prove it right now. Frank gestured to Count Basie and the orchestra. Gentlemen, let's take it from the top. My way. But this time, we're going to do it different. As the orchestra began playing, Frank did something unprecedented. He positioned Michael's wheelchair right at center stage, handed him a microphone, and said, when I get to the chorus, I want you to sing it with me. Just do your best. The song began, and Frank delivered the verses with more emotion than anyone had ever heard him sing before. But when it came to the chorus, he held the microphone out to Michael. For just a second, Michael froze. Then, in a shaky but determined voice, he sang, I did it my way. His voice cracked. It wasn't pretty. But when 20,789 people heard this wounded veteran, this young man who'd lost so much, singing those words, something magical happened in Madison Square Garden. The entire arena joined in, not screaming or shouting, but singing together. their voices blending into something that sounded like a prayer, like a promise, like a declaration. I did it my way. Frank kept singing, kept leading, but now he was singing with Michael and with 20,000 other people who understood that they were witnessing something more important than a concert. They were witnessing a healing. When the song ended, Frank did something that became one of the most iconic moments in his entire career. He took the medal from his own lapel, a special commendation he'd received from President Kennedy, and he pinned it on Michael's uniform. "This is for you," Frank said, "for reminding me why I sing, for reminding all of us why we're here." Michael, tears streaming down his face, looked up at Frank and said something that the microphone barely caught. "Thank you for giving me my way back." Frank knelt down beside the wheelchair and said, "Kid, you never lost it. You just forgot where you put it." The standing ovation lasted 12 minutes. People weren't just clapping. They were crying. They were cheering. They were bearing witness to a moment that transcended entertainment and became something sacred. Frank finished the concert with Michael on the side of the stage, occasionally wheeling him out for songs, making him part of the show, showing 20,000 people that disability didn't mean invisible, and that heroism came in many forms. After the concert, Frank spent another 2 hours with the Morrison family in his dressing room. He made phone calls. He wrote checks. He connected Michael with rehabilitation specialists, prosthetic experts, and most importantly, he gave Michael his private number. "You call me if you ever feel like you're losing your way," Frank said. "Day or night, I don't care. You call me and I'll remind you who you are." But here's the part of the story that nobody saw coming. The part that changed everything. Michael Morrison didn't just survive that night. He thrived. True to his word, Frank Sinatra made sure Michael got an interview at St. Anthony's Prep. Michael got the job. For the next 35 years, Michael Morrison taught American history to thousands of students, many of whom later said he was the most influential teacher they ever had. He did eventually marry, not his old girlfriend who'd abandoned him, but a nurse he met at the VA hospital who saw him as a whole man from day one. They had 3 children, all of whom Michael taught to fish from a specially modified boat that Frank Sinatra helped pay for. But the impact of that night went far beyond one veteran. Frank Sinatra was so moved by Michael's story and by the reality of how returning Vietnam veterans were being treated that he established the Sinatra Veterans Foundation in January 1970. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide job placement, education, and rehabilitation services for wounded veterans. Over the next 3 decades, the foundation helped more than 15,000 veterans transition back to civilian life. It provided scholarships, job training, prosthetics, psychological counseling, and most importantly, dignity. Frank made it his personal mission to attend every major fundraiser, to meet with veterans personally, and to use his fame to change how America treated its returning soldiers. "I sang about doing it my way for years," Frank said in a 1978 interview. "But I didn't really understand what those words meant until I met Michael Morrison. That kid showed me that having a way isn't about circumstances. It's about choices. It's about refusing to let the worst day of your life define all the days that come after." The concert where Frank stopped the show for Michael Morrison was recorded, though the recording wasn't released publicly until 1992. When it was finally released as part of a box set, with all proceeds going to the Sinatra Veterans Foundation, it became one of the best-selling Sinatra albums of the 1990s. People didn't buy it for the music, though the music was exceptional. They bought it to hear that moment when Michael Morrison sang "I Did It My Way" with Frank, to hear the arena full of people joining in, and to remember that night when entertainment became healing. Michael Morrison, before his death in 2019 at age 73, gave hundreds of speeches about that night. He spoke at schools, at veterans' halls, at military bases around the world. In every speech, he told the same story about the night Frank Sinatra gave him his life back. "Frank Sinatra saved me," Michael would say, "but not by giving me money or connections, though he did those things too. He saved me by showing me that my value as a man wasn't my legs. It was in my character and my choices, in my refusal to give up." The recording of that concert became required listening at Walter Reed Medical Center for wounded soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Therapists found that hearing Michael's story, hearing his voice crack as he sang with Frank, helped other wounded veterans understand that their lives weren't over, just different. Frank Sinatra himself said that the concert on December 8th, 1969, was the most important performance of his career. Not because of the music, though he'd sung beautifully. Not because of the size of the crowd, though it was massive. But because he'd used his platform to do what performers are really supposed to do. To help someone find hope when they thought there was none left to find. The incident changed how Frank approached every performance after that night. He started paying attention to the audience in a different way, looking for people who seemed to be struggling, making eye contact with veterans, acknowledging their service, using his shows not just to entertain, but to heal. Other performers took notice. Stories began circulating in Hollywood about what Frank had done for Michael Morrison. Bob Hope, who had made a career of entertaining troops, called Frank personally to tell him how moved he'd been by the story. Elvis Presley, who was in the midst of his own comeback, cited Frank's handling of the Morrison situation as an inspiration for how he interacted with fans. "This is what we're supposed to do with fame," Elvis reportedly said. "We're supposed to use it to help people, not just to sell records and make money." The story became legendary in military circles. Commanders would tell new recruits about Sergeant Morrison and Frank Sinatra, using it as an example of resilience, of adapting to new circumstances, of refusing to be defined by injury or setback. In 1985, President Reagan invited both Frank Sinatra and Michael Morrison to the White House for a special ceremony honoring veterans. During his speech, Reagan said, "What happened between these two men on a stage in New York represents the best of what America can be. One man had fame and used it to help. Another man had courage and used it to heal. Together, they showed us that service to country doesn't end when you take off the uniform." Michael Morrison, sitting in his wheelchair next to Frank Sinatra, both men now older, but their bond as strong as ever, whispered to Frank, "Can you believe we're here?" Frank smiled and whispered back, "Kid, I told you the story wasn't over." The foundation that Frank started because of that night continued operating long after Frank's death in 1998. It's still running today, now called the Sinatra Morrison Veterans Foundation, helping veterans find their way when they think they've lost it. To date, the foundation has served more than 50,000 veterans and their families, providing everything from job placement to prosthetics to psychological counseling to educational scholarships. Every person who receives help from the foundation is told the story of December 8th, 1969, the night a wounded soldier interrupted a concert and the legendary performer stopped everything to help him. The story of Frank Sinatra and Michael Morrison reminds us that the greatest performances aren't always the ones with the best vocals or the biggest crowds. Sometimes the greatest performances are the ones where we stop performing altogether and just show up as human beings for another human being who needs us. Frank could have ignored Michael's outburst. He could have had security remove him, finished his concert, and gone home. After all, he had 20,789 other people to think about. But Frank understood something that night that changed both men's lives forever. He understood that behind every interruption is a person, and behind every person is a story, and sometimes the story is more important than the show. In doing so, Frank gave Michael more than hope. He gave him a way forward. He showed a wounded veteran that his life still had value, still had purpose, still had meaning. And he showed 20,789 people, and millions more who heard the story later, what it looks like when someone with power chooses to use it to lift someone up instead of pushing them aside. Today, there's a plaque at the site where Madison Square Garden stood in 1969, before it was renovated and rebuilt. The plaque reads, on this site, December 8th, 1969, Frank Sinatra taught us that the show must go on, but sometimes it must go on differently. In memory of Sergeant Michael James Morrison and all veterans who found their way home. Every performer who plays Madison Square Garden today sees that plaque. Many of them ask about the story behind it. When they hear about Frank and Michael, about the interrupted concert and the transformed life, something changes in how they think about their own relationship with their audience. Because the story of that December night reminds us all that we never know who's out there listening. We never know who needs a word of encouragement, a gesture of kindness, or just the acknowledgement that they matter. Frank Sinatra stopped a show for Michael Morrison. But really, Michael Morrison saved Frank Sinatra's show by reminding him what shows are really for. They're not for applause or ticket sales or critical acclaim. They're for connection. They're for healing. They're for reminding each other that we're all trying to find our way. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is helping them find theirs. If this incredible story of courage and compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of refusing to give up, even when everything seems lost. Have you ever had someone help you find your way when you thought you'd lost it? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that change everything.